Jesus walks out into a flat place and begins to speak. We call this the Sermon on the Plain. In the Gospel of Matthew, it's the Sermon on the Mount. And in Matthew, you hear, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. But in Luke, it is much more practical, it seems. It's just blessed are the poor, not the poor in spirit. Just blessed are the poor. Not blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, but blessed are those who just hunger. Blessed are those who weep, and blessed are those who are left out and abused and all that terrible stuff on account of his name. Now, as he's speaking these words, all of these blessings sound wonderful, but then Jesus adds some stuff as he's speaking here in this flat place. He says, woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who are filled up now. Woe to you who laugh. Woe to you when all speak well of you. And these are words, then, of challenge. So these blessing words are, telling people you have a share in the kingdom of heaven, and then you've got these words of challenge. Now, there are different ways that we experience challenge. Sometimes we choose challenge. In 2006, I wanted to run a half marathon. That was very challenging, but it was a challenge I chose. And when I was finished, I felt like I accomplished something. So when we choose a challenge, there's that accomplishment that can go with it. Other times, though, we get a challenge that we didn't choose. We lose our job, or we get a health diagnosis that's going to be lengthy in treatment. Those challenges, we don't so much accomplish as we do to try to endure or overcome or survive, or however we want to phrase that, right? We get this challenge, we just try to live through it. But then there's another kind of challenge, and this is one we get today from Jesus, as he says, woe to you who are rich, and woe to you who are full, and woe to you who laugh. This is a challenge to a worldview. And when we get our challenge to a worldview, it's a little bit different. I did an internship in a silicone wafer plant when I was in engineering school, and it wasn't one big manufacturing floor. There was lots of little pockets in the way they made these silicone wafers. And we were off on the one end of the plant, two of us engineering students. There were 28 interns that summer. Every one of them had their own project, except for we two shared a project. I was a mechanical engineering student, and she was electrical engineering, and it took both of our bits of work to make what we were assigned work and get designed and done. And my office was this little cubicle with these little short brown cue walls up against the office wall in our engineering office suite. And if I got up my cube and walked out the door, you could see the windows into our part of the plant down here. There was a shop right here of our maintenance people that did the work that we designed. And if you went this way, you went down a hall to the rest of the plant. And all along that hall, there were posters, like safety posters to make sure you had on the right safety equipment when you were going to places, and posters about the company and mission and different things like that. And it was in that space, just outside that door, that I was standing with my peer one day, and we were talking to an engineer who was about my dad's age. He still had brown, tufty hair on top, a little bit of gray on the sides. And we finished the conversation, and he walked away, and she said, "Unbelievable." And I said, "Unbelievable what?" And she said, "Well, didn't you notice?" I said, "Notice what?" And she said, "They all talk to you. Even when it's about my work, they talk to you." So all of a sudden now, I've been made aware of something, and this is now a challenge to my worldview, right? And so there are different ways we respond to these. And all of these are why it's so hard to talk about race in our culture, and hard to talk about wealth in our culture, all kinds of things. So one way I could have responded would have been to ignore it, and just said like, "Oh, you're overreacting. They're just talking to us both at the same time," and just pretended like this didn't happen. But I couldn't ignore it, because the more I paid attention, it was true. Every time we had a conversation with one of the engineers in the plant, they just talked to me. They never talked to her, even if it was about her work, which I didn't even understand. We had a vendor that she called to get questions answered about some equipment we were ordering, and left him a message, and he called me back. So I couldn't ignore it so much, right? Well, then there's a second option we have, and that option is to kind of fight back, because we feel threatened when someone points these things out. And my response in that case would have been something like, "Hey, I am not a sexist. Why are you pointing a finger at me when these other guys are the ones that are behaving in this way?" And this is what happens in our culture, right? Anytime you bring up something about white privilege or race, somebody says, hey, I'm not a racist, right? We have to defend ourselves and fight back against those things. So then we get to a third option, which I think might be the most dangerous one. I'm not sure. Right? You can ignore it. You can fight back against it. The third one is we have our eyes opened a little bit and have this invitation to be transformed, and then we think we are, even though we don't really. So we kind of do a little bit of work, but don't really give up any of the power or the place that we have. And this is what I did. What I started to do was to try to pull her into conversations by saying, no, we are working on this. And I did that a lot more, right? And I tried to make sure we included her in all of these things. At the end of the summer, we had to do a presentation for the plant manager. And each intern was supposed to do their own because it was your job interview for when you graduated that next year. And we looked at our work, and as I remember, the two of us decided that we didn't really see how we could do two presentations because it took both pieces to do the one thing that we did. And our engineer mentor said, well, if you do one, you have to make sure it's very clear that you each had your own work that you did on your own. So she and I worked really hard for like 2 weeks. We practiced and practiced to make sure that it looked like two presentations. When I look back now, I always felt like I had paid attention and listened to her and done all this good work of making sure, right, that I was not contributing to all of this. When I look back, I did not give up any of my space or any of my privilege or power I had as a white student engineer in that place. I just tried to include her in my space. Like, I didn't say she, I said we. And then when you get to talking about that presentation, I look back now and think, well, that's ridiculous. Of course we could have did two presentations. So then I wonder if she really wanted to do two presentations, but I couldn't figure out how to do two presentations, so I said we should do two, and she just went along with it. So that instead of having her own space up there to tell her story, I was up there standing with her. So do you see the difference? Right? I had this invitation, and I didn't necessarily ignore it, and I didn't fight back against it, but I really didn't get transformed by it either. The thing is, though, I got to spend a lot of years thinking that I did, because I did some stuff, and then I could feel like I was doing better and contributing. So as we hear words from Jesus like this today that come as a challenge, I find them particularly challenging. The first one is, woe to you who are rich. Now, I'm going to guess most of you don't feel rich, and I never have, but then I went to Haiti, and then I went to Haiti again, and I spent time around people who don't eat every day. I've been to the high desert in Mexico to build houses for people on a mission trip I went on. I've been to one of the poorest counties in rural America. And every time in those places, I realize that I am indeed wealthy relative to the rest of the world. Maybe not wealthy relative to like the wealthiest people, but relative to the vast majority of the world, I am wealthy. Second one, blessed are you who are full. I eat way too much every day. Like, full is not a concept in my brain. I just keep eating. So I'm definitely full. The third one, woe to you who laugh. I laugh a lot, and it's because you all are wonderful, and my kids are funny, and my wife is funny, and I live in a place where it's just easy to laugh. But the last one is the one that really has been nagging at me this week. Blessed are you, and I'll speak well of you, because that's what their ancestors did to the false prophets. And I've gathered that most of you speak well about me. And that has got me wondering if I'm a false prophet. And I mean that in dead seriousness, right? If I'm up here just standing here convincing us that we're all doing just fine. We may not fight against these woes, like woe to you rich and all that. We may not be ignoring it. And we may not be fighting it, or we might say, well, I'm not rich. But then you get to the third one and say, well, you can start to justify things and say, well, yeah, we have a lot, but we share and we're generous. Or look at all the wonderful things we did, and we can celebrate all of that while not really being transformed by these words that Jesus speaks to us. And for me, as I've wrestled with this all week, I've wondered if part of my role, if I am a false prophet, is just to convince us that we're doing just fine and that Jesus loves us and we're good, right? And so I really wrestle with this. Now, there is grace in this story. If you were listening and heard it, what happened before Jesus began to speak? He walked out into a flat place. There was a huge healing. Absolutely. There's this huge multitude, and it says power went out from him, and all of them were healed. All of them. So the first thing that happens in this narrative is not that they got their act together. It's not that they were super enlightened and changed the world around them and made it a place of equality and equity for all. The first thing that happened was people were healed. They were given a gift of grace and life. The second thing that happens then is that Jesus speaks words that are going to be challenging for some of them. That challenge, that woe, right, isn't necessarily a woe later. It's a woe now. Woe to you, right? It's not later woe to you. So he speaks a challenge, and then the next thing that happens, which we'll hear next Sunday, is that he gives them some guidance on how to live into the challenge. Next week we'll hear basically you should be generous. Generous of spirit, generous with your stuff, generous with forgiveness. Being generous is how you live into that life. So there's a three-part movement. First comes the gift of life and healing. Then comes this challenge. Then comes some instructions on how to live into that. And this really is kind of the pattern that Jesus' whole ministry takes on. As he ends up on the cross and dies, that is a gift of life even in death. When he comes into the resurrection, it is a gift of life. And none of us were even there yet, so we couldn't have done anything to earn that. That is the gift that comes first. Then come the words of challenge. Now sometimes those words of challenge come to us in Scripture, like they do today. Other times those words of challenge come when your colleague looks at you and says, they all talk to you. Those words of challenge can come in lots of ways. And then we get to the next part, which is then instructions on how we live into that. And the whole of the Gospels are filled with Jesus giving us commands about loving our neighbor as ourselves and feeding people that are hungry and clothing people that are naked. All of the stuff is right there. But it's this three-part movement. This gift of life, a challenge to live into that gift of life, and then out the other side of it, some instructions when we aren't quite sure how to do that. Now, I would argue that that challenge in the middle is actually full of grace. Because we've already got the gift of life. It's already been given to us. So when Jesus looks at us and says, woe to you, I think what he's saying is you can continue to live the way you're living and feel comfortable the way you are, but there's a whole better way of being that's right here. I've already given it to you. And then here's how you live into it. Now in this particular case, woe to you who are rich and full and laugh all the time. I think part of that challenge is for us to maybe think about how our economics work. Because our capitalism is broken. It has one goal, and that goal is profit. And that profit goes to who? A very tiny number of people. Right? And that is the only goal of it. So our jobs go other places and whole things, all of it happens because some people, a very few number of people, want to get richer. Right? And so if that is the environment we live in, and we spend all of our days trying to keep up and hope that we can get to that small number of people and all the rest of that, that's not a healthy way for us to live. Many of you, if you're still working, you have jobs that you go to and toil away at every day, just hoping you can kind of break even at the end of the day, while someone else is more than breaking even. And this is not healthy. And so when we hear these woes, they are not some far off thing. It's woe to you in the way you live in these economics. And guess what? I've already given you a gift of life, and there's a way that you can live into that gift of life, and it is to be generous, which is what we'll hear next week, right? So this movement is Jesus trying to free us from the brokenness in which we live. And so we may hear it as a challenge that makes us uncomfortable, but ultimately it is an invitation for us to live in this gift of grace. And I think where we might start to experience that transformation first is in the third one. Woe to you who weep. And where we might start to feel that is when we see things that start to break our hearts and realize that they are the same things that break God's heart, and then they start to make us weep. Haiti right now is a terrible mess. There are riots in the streets and all kinds of stuff that's probably not on the news that you see. I see it because I'm connected to lots of people that do work in Haiti, and I've read stories this week about people fainting from not having eaten for a week. And about hopeful stories too, about these roadblocks that get created and they let through the people that are helpers, like nurses and others that are going to serve other people. But when you hear all of this, if that does not break your heart and make you weep for the struggle that they have, then you're never going to be able to get to that place of transformation that Jesus invites us into. But when we begin to weep for those places, the next thing that follows will be generosity, just because it does. Because we can't help but respond. And that again is how that grace comes alive in us. Because Jesus has already given us this gift challenges us to live into that gift, trusting that when we get there, we will find out what real life really looks like, and then gives us some guidance along the way on how to do that. So I'd love to wrap this up for you today and send you home feeling like super hopeful and comfortable with yourself. But that is not how I'm going home, because this challenge has landed pretty heavy on me. And so I hope you have a challenge that you carry with you. And if that makes you a little uncomfortable this week, good. And I hope that is a gift of grace for you, because it's been a gift of grace for me, and it is the gift of grace that Jesus gives us to stretch us and grow us in his grace. Amen.